So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Nami Hawk, Senior Vice President with Ipsos Market Strategy and Understanding. Nami, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. We're really excited to be here today and to share some of the insights from our Ipsos Essentials study. If you're new to Essentials, you haven't been involved in the program before, it's a global syndicated tracking study that's active in 15 different countries and tracks all sorts of consumer behaviors related to a broad range of issues. Allison and I have been really lucky enough to be working on this since it began in 2020, meaning we've been sort of at the front lines of consumer behavior shifts through the pandemic, which has been really, really amazing to see. Excuse me. Today we're going to share some of the highlights from the US data set. So we've been asked to focus on the US today, and we're going to be talking about what we've seen over the past year and a little bit about what we're expecting as we kick off the new year as well. So today's goal is really to give you a flavor of the type of data that we collect and to get you thinking about some of the bigger shifts that we're seeing in consumer behavior. And if you like what you see today, there's a ton more behind the scenes. So I mentioned we're in 15 countries. We've got all sorts of demo data. We've got surveys that go out every month collecting all sorts of insights. So that's what it is. And with that, let's dig into it. So we're going to start by looking back and talking about what we've seen over the past year. 2022 was definitely a bit of a tumultuous year for Americans. There was a lot going on. There was the pandemic waning at the beginning of the year, the war that began overseas. We had inflationary pressures and market corrections in the spring and summer. And there was floods and fires in the summertime. And then, we brought it all full circle again in the fall and winter with another round of COVID. So lots going on, kind of a bit of a volatile world in 2022. So one of the things about working on this study is it's not always good news, but it is definitely always insightful. So the past couple years, it brought around what we call at Ipsos, we're using the term polycrisis. It's not one thing, it's usually a bunch of things that are hitting consumers. When we started Ipsos Essentials at the beginning of the pandemic, the first issue was February 2020, it was really designed to track the pandemic and COVID. And we continue to add topics to the study because we want to cover a broader range of issues. So now we're covering, COVID and health and economy and finances, environment, conflict and political issues, crime, violence, all sorts of different issues that are facing Americans. And we're going to talk about the impact, the profound impact that these things are having on their attitudes and behaviors, which is really the essence of the study. The goal of Ipsos Essentials is to track shifts in attitudes and behaviors amid times of crisis and adaptation. And to provide a little bit of perspective on just how quickly things have been changing, we'll start by comparing people's top priorities from a year ago to where they are today. So the beginning of 2022, COVID was still really the prevailing issue. So this is responses to a question we asked people what their top priority is right now. January 2022, we bucketed things into, there's a longer list, we bucketed them, and you can see that really it's the predominant issue was COVID-19 and health issues, with economy coming in as a close second. Jump forward to December, the end of the year, and we see that COVID is a far less of a priority, and the economy and personal finances and people's personal financial situation really is a top priority for half of Americans. We also had a couple notable changes throughout the year. So political conflict spiked in March. That was following the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, and then it spiked again to a lesser extent in October when President Vladimir Putin was threatening to use nuclear response in Ukraine. So we saw a couple spikes on that, but it's more or less stabilized by the end of the year. And then we also saw the environment spike at around 10–11% in the summer when Americans were dealing with the floods and the fires and all of that. And again, that's settled back down towards the end of the year, but we did see a couple notable spikes there mid-year. So it's one thing to see the numbers. We also want to hear from a couple of consumers. So part of what we do in Essentials is we also gather ethnographies. And what we've done today is put together a short little video just with a couple of responses from some of our American participants. So if you want to turn up your audio to make sure you can hear, I'm going to play a short video and then we'll jump back into the presentation.
2022 felt like the year that a lot of things went back to normal after COVID. Like, my kids didn't have to wear masks at school. A lot of just like feeling like, oh, we're just not going to talk about that anymore. we're just going to pretend that didn't happen.
So I used to go out a lot more, but due to inflation, I really feel like I can't. So that's how things have changed in a year, but I'm pretty much doing the same thing, working and home. When I'm home, I'm just lounging, cleaning, cooking meals. And like I said, sometimes we go out, but because of everything being so expensive, we've gone out a lot less.
Okay, so that was just a very quick little snippet, but it highlights what we were talking about in terms of the decline in COVID concern and the growing concern about rising cost of living, and as a result, the decline in sort of going out. You heard the second woman talk about, I'm spending more time at home and cleaning at home and cooking at home, and just increasing the amount of time we spend at home. It's funny because during the pandemic, consumers were stuck inside for 2 years because they were worried about getting sick, and they were worried about sort of not going out and doing everything at home. And now we can go out, and people aren't because they can't afford to go out. So it's a sort of a retreat back to our homes and in-home occasions, and that's exactly what we're seeing in the data as well. So as a start, before we get into some of that, let's start with just how much of a problem is inflation and rising prices for Americans? How much are they feeling at risk? At the end of last year, 71% of Americans said that they felt either at high risk due to inflation or at medium risk. So that's just adding the 35 and the 36. And exactly half of them were in that high risk group, and the other half were sort of in that medium risk group. So just over a third of Americans said that they're at high risk due to inflation right now. And that sentiment really peaked over the summer months. Inflation was still a bit fresher in people's minds, and they were still trying to do all the things that they wanted to do in terms of enjoying themselves and take vacations and travel and go out and see people and take advantage of those summer months. And so we did see those numbers spike a bit, and then they've sort of come back down. But it's still, 7 out of 10 Americans feeling at risk due to inflation. And if we look at who's most impacted right now, it's women that tend to be most impacted, Gen X, and Allison's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides, and middle-income Americans, which is interesting. We often think of inflation being disproportionately impacting lower income households, but it's actually the middle income households that are feeling at highest risk, and likely because a lot of them are dealing with mortgages and rising debt and sort of living paycheck to paycheck, trying to just keep everything in check. And so it's definitely higher for those three groups. So Allison's going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, but let's continue to explore how this is impacting behaviors. So people are feeling at risk of inflation, and we can see that playing out in their behaviors as well. The very first thing that we've noticed, when inflation first began, was that people started to eat out less. They started to have more meal occasions at home, and that was, across eating out, dining at restaurants, getting takeout, drive-through, all of those. People were doing less of that over the past year. And this is highest, as you might imagine, amongst those who are feeling at highest risk due to inflation, which is exactly what we're seeing on the chart here. So we asked people, what are the changes you made in the past 2 weeks to help manage costs? And the options we're showing here are eating at a restaurant less and having more meal occasions at home, and purchasing fewer pre-made meals and cooking at home more. And we can see that percentage of people that are doing that over the past 2 weeks is much higher amongst those that felt that they were at high risk due to inflation. This data is from December. The little arrows that you see are where we're seeing statistical increases since mid-year, since the June time frame. So since June, more people at high risk are saying that they're eating out less, and more people at medium risk are saying that they're eating out less, and we've seen that sort of grow throughout the year. So people are eating out less. Naturally, they are cooking at home more, and that's what we're seeing here. So it's been most notable amongst your older generations, likely. Maybe some of the Gen Z folks aren't as good at cooking at home, don't have necessarily maybe the skills to cook as much at home, but we did see an increase in cooking from scratch throughout the year. So this is over the past 4 weeks, again, data from December. Depending on the generation, anywhere from half to 80% of people saying that they're cooking from scratch. And it's not just cooking. So this extends into other activities at home as well. So this question here, in December, we asked people, in what ways did you change how you spend your time over the past year? So thinking back on the past year, did you spend more or less time on different activities? And some of the top activities that people were spending more time on were cooking. So we talked about that, cooking at home, watching TVs, movies, Netflix, all of that, and working at their jobs. Interestingly, Gen Z and millennials were most likely to have made shifts in how they spend their time, and actually claiming to be doing more across all activities. So that's a lot. Their lives, if you talk to a Gen Z or millennial panelist, they'll tell you it feels like it's gotten a lot busier over the past year because they are doing all of these things. They're cooking, they're watching TV, they're working more, they're socializing more, they're cleaning more, they're spending time more on social media, all the things they're spending more time on. If we think about those inflation groups that we talked about, those that are most disproportionately impacted by inflation, well, they're more likely to be doing the things on the left. They're more likely to be cooking more, spending more time entertaining at home, watching TV, movies, and more time working at home or working at their jobs, whether that at home or in the office, but for a good number of people working at home. And if we look at those that are insulated from inflation, that sort of 25% that said, inflation is a low risk or not a risk to me right now, they're living a much better life. It's more likely to be socializing, whether in person or on social media. More likely to be shopping. It's not shown here, but we asked about that too. More likely to be being intimate, having sex, all the fun things the people who are insulated from inflation are more likely to be spending time doing. So it really is the story of sort of haves and have-nots as we get through this inflation crisis right now. But as much as people are spending more time at home, more meals at home, more entertainment at home, they're also longing to get away. And many Americans are prioritizing travel as part of that. So what we're seeing here is travel plans over the next 3 months. And travel was interestingly, one of the last things I mentioned. Eating out was one of the first things that Americans let go of when they started dealing with inflation. Travel was one of the last things they let go. So at the beginning of the year, right after the initial Omicron wave, we saw a big jump in travel interest. Which peaked in the spring. So some of that is seasonality. Some of that is people just, itching to get out after the pandemic sort of died down. But we saw a big increase in the spring and summer in terms of travel plans. And then slowly as the reality of inflation kicked in and as the summer travel period ended, so a little bit of inflation, a little bit of seasonality, we saw travel intent decline through the summer and fall, and then it sort of stayed steady heading into the holidays with a dip. Again, seasonality towards the end of the year as people aren't making as many trips into the winter months. And then, Allison's going to talk more about 2023 and what we're seeing for this year, but we have seen, just wanted to give you the little snippet there, we are seeing a little bit of an uptick again in January, some renewed interest as we're heading into 2023. So I mentioned, people are cash strapped, they're saving money by not eating out. Allison will talk about how they're saving money when they're shopping. Question is, how are people paying for all this travel? Well, a good number of them are putting it on their credit cards. So 37% of Americans used a credit card to pay for travel or vacation in December. And, we've seen a steady sort of use of credit cards. There was a increase back in 2020, when we first started tracking at the beginning of the pandemic. People started using their credit cards because they were buying things online because they didn't want to touch cash. Everyone's sort of afraid of handling money. And so there was an increase in credit card usage. And we've seen that usage pretty much sustain over the past 3 years. There hasn't been really much of a noticeable drop, but likely, it started off being due to the pandemic. It's for different reasons now, likely more because people need cash flow. And unfortunately, sometimes even using credit cards using debt to pay bills. If you're from financial services, you probably have your own data in terms of that. But what we're seeing in terms of third-party data sources is that credit card debt is increasing again in the U.S. after dipping during the pandemic when people were more likely to be saving money. So how Americans have been spending their money. We talked about eating out, we talked about travel is one side of the equation. At the same time, consumers are also looking to of ways to sort of increase their cash flow, to increase their accounts receivable, if you will. And one of the things that Americans have been doing to try to make ends meet is they've been hustling. So we have a question we ask Americans if, aside from a regular job, do you have any additional ways of making money, any sort of side hustles? And what we're seeing is that 4 out of 10 Americans right now do have some sort of side hustle. That's higher amongst your younger generations. So if you're a Gen Z or a millennial, you're much more likely to be having some sort of side hustle. And it involves all sorts of different activities. So you can see some of the top ones there on the right: investing in stocks online, doing odd jobs, contract work, making goods, selling goods, a number of different things that Americans are trying to do to again increase that cash flow. So with all of this hustling and the shifts in time spent, I meant more time spending cooking and cleaning and spending time at home and hustling to make some money. It's no surprise that some things are also getting deprioritized for Americans. Unfortunately, one of the things that we're seeing getting deprioritized has been the environment. So with busier lives and inflation worries, fewer consumers are feeling responsible for the environment than at the beginning of the year. So, this is just one of the attitudinal statements we capture. I feel guilty about my impact on the environment. It's 37% in November. That's down 5% from where it was in the summertime. And we understand, like, people are busy and we focus on what's easy to do, and it's not always easy to prioritize the environment with so many things going on. We ask citizens what actions they feel would benefit the environment the most, as well as what they're currently doing. And in both instances, we really see a bias towards, again, what's easy and accessible to achieve right now. So we start by asking what do you think is most helpful to the environment, and we see things like recycling as much as possible, replacing bulbs with more energy efficient light bulbs, maybe buying renewable energy or using energy from renewable sources. So those things on the left, easier, more accessible. Interestingly though, the things on the right, eating a plant-based diet, avoiding long distance travel, not driving as much, those, in actuality have a bigger impact on reducing carbon emissions and helping improve the environment, but that's not what consumers are choosing to focus on. So we also ask consumers what they are currently doing to help the environment, and again, it's skewing towards the left, the things that are easy, accessible, recycling, changing light bulbs. Right now, because of inflation, might be easier to avoid flying, not using your car for trips because of the price of gas. So we see an increase there too in terms of what people are currently doing. What they're not doing is some of those things in the middle that are maybe more expensive and not as accessible. So buying energy from renewable sources, driving an electric car or hybrid car, which might come at a higher cost. So, consumers may not always be doing the things that are most helpful, but they are showing that they care. And in many cases, consumers do feel like they are doing their part. But they don't feel like governments and companies are doing enough on their end. So consumers feel like they're acting. They feel like the onus now is on governments and companies to make it easier for them to act. So we asked citizens who they think should be acting, and that's the data we see here. So they put a lot of onus on themselves. 43% of Americans feel like it's up to the citizens to help the environment. Slightly more feel that it's really up to governments. And private companies actually get a bit of a break. They're the lowest of the three in terms of it being their responsibility to act. Now, the bad news, we ask consumers who they think is acting, is taking action, is doing enough. They give themselves a pretty good score, 41 out of 43, but a much lower grade for governments and private companies. So they feel like there's a bigger responsibility to action gap. You see 25% for government, 14% for private companies. They really feel like both of governments and companies should be doing more. So that's a bit of a summary from what we're seeing 2022. We talked about some of the big issues. Just to quickly summarize some of the trends we're seeing, we saw that worries about COVID were declining. So people were much less worried about COVID, much more worried about inflation. We saw people were coping with inflation by spending more time at home. They were working more, they were hustling, they were having less out-of-home occasions, whether for entertainment or for meals. And we saw as a result of all that, both financial pressures, time pressures, people were starting to deprioritize a little bit the environment, brush aside some of that and really say, it's now up to governments and companies. It's up to you guys to take action at this point. So that's what we're seeing from the past year. I'm going to pass it on to Allison now to talk a little bit about what we can expect in 2023.
Okay, thank you, Nami. So in 2022, we certainly saw a shift in priorities. And when people were finally learning to live with COVID and put it aside, they were really slapped in the face with the inflation issue. So we saw from what Nami just shared with us that they had to really adjust quickly to make ends meet by sacrificing dining and entertainment and taking on more work. So unfortunately, as we start the new year, we cannot say goodbye to the problems of last year. So in this next section, we're really going to cover what we can all expect in 2023. Americans are starting the year with the same challenges. Namely the inflation, COVID, and climate. Inflation continues to be the biggest concern, with over 3/4 of Americans feeling that inflation is a higher or moderate risk to them. Generation X feels most at risk to inflation, and this really may be because at this point in their life, they may be putting their children through college, caring for elders, and at the same time, at this point in their life stage, might be feeling that their careers are starting to plateau. And we also look at our data by people who identify as Republicans versus Democrats. And what's also interesting, but not surprising, is that Republicans are more worried about inflation than Democrats. So 81% of Republicans are worried about inflation versus 72% of Democrats, although 72% of Democrats being worried about inflation is still very high. So what does this really mean to marketers who are trying to connect with consumers in the new year? Should they be using the same strategies as last year? The answer is no. While the challenges consumers face are largely the same as last year, they're definitely responding differently from what we can see at the start of this year. So let's first take a look at how consumers are handling inflation and rising prices. So we see that consumers are really starting to take control of their finances in 2023. They're not just spending less and sacrificing. We'll see what they're doing in the next couple of slides. But we're thinking that the kind of shock of the inflation is over with. It's still there, but consumers have had time to absorb what's going on, think about it, and really start to build their own strategies for dealing with it. Okay, so before we dive into exactly how they're taking control of their finances, I just want to take a couple of minutes to examine some of the financial pressures people are dealing with today. So one of the questions we ask is, are prices, higher than your expectations, the same or lower? And we look at this for different categories, and we see that no matter really what the category, consumers feel that prices are higher than expected, and that's in January. So whether it's food or personal products or clothing or entertainment or medication or electronics, they're looking at prices and it's higher than they're expecting. And food in particular is really, really, I guess, the big shock to people when they're seeing the prices of food. And interestingly, you'll see the breakout above food between generations. The older you are, the higher food prices seem to be for you. And that's probably because people, the older they get, they're remembering food as being a lot less expensive, and also they might be on more limited incomes and things like that. So this is really not great news, of course, for anybody, whether you're the consumer or the business. And as we're going to see in the next slide, consumers are starting to point their fingers at companies. So nearly 3/4 of Americans say that companies are using inflation as a way to increase their profits. And moreover, as we see on the right-hand side of the slide, consumers don't think that stores, brands, or the government are doing a good job at helping them to improve their financial situation. They have a somewhat better opinion about financial institutions, but still there's room for improvement, with 40% of people saying that financial institutions are not helping them. And not surprisingly, when we look at the Democrats versus Republicans, the Republicans think that the government is doing a much worse job at helping them improve their finances. So the economic situation is bad, and consumers do not feel like the government or brands are helping them that much, so they're taking control themselves. Okay, so here we see that this is a chart about how the extent to which people can save, whether they're able to save, whether they're spending more day to day, or if they're living paycheck to paycheck. And as we can see here, many Gen X and millennials are living paycheck to paycheck. But they recognize this and they're cutting back on their spending. Millennials and Gen X much more than Gen Z and boomers. But that people know that's really not enough, and cutting back on their spending is not going to help them get ahead in the long term. So let's see what else they're doing. Okay, so we see here that over half the people that we surveyed say that they learned to better manage their finances in the past 12 months. And about a third have made a New Year's resolution to manage their finances better in 2023. And in this next chart on the right, we really correlate people's self-described state of mind with how well they're managing their finances. And what we see is that those who manage their finances better tend to feel more optimistic and more well prepared, and those who don't feel like they're controlling their finances feel more frustrated and feel more scared. So we're going to now go over what they're doing in more detail to manage their finances. And we see that overall, 1 in 5 consumers either added or changed a financial service in the past month. And when it comes to actually adding a service, this is more likely to occur with Gen Z and millennials. Those are the ones who are more likely to be adding financial services. Now let's look exactly how do they do this? How do they go about managing their financial services? So we asked people about what channels they use to research, change, or add financial services. And they definitely prefer to manage their financial services online or through an app. So it kind of shows us that the online behavior that started during the pandemic, along with the latest technology and people's adaptation to that, has really stuck. So this is what they're doing for their financial management overall. So now we're going to take a look at what they do day to day. So when consumers are shopping, they're really being a lot more proactive than they were last year. Versus 6 months ago. So this chart is comparing what they're doing when they shop to manage rising prices in January versus 6 months ago. So definitely looking for more deals and coupons, but they're also, we've seen increase in switching brands, buying generic brands, and shopping at stores that offer better prices. And of course, this is a red flag for brands and retailers alike, because as we know, some of these behaviors are going to be hard to undo. So now we're going to turn to actual spending. Okay, we asked people if they expected to spend more money this month versus last month on a variety of different categories, and compared to what they said last year. So for nearly every category here, again, food, clothing, entertainment, people are not planning to spend more this year compared to last year. We see their spending patterns this January are pretty identical to what their spending patterns were last January. And these categories here are kind of small ticket purchases. So next we're going to look at their planned spending for bigger ticket items. And here we examine different high ticket items, cars, vacations, telecommunications, buying a house, things like that. And we see that people are slightly more interested in buying automobiles and large appliances compared to last year. And that this is especially true for millennials, who may be at a point in their lives where they need these things. So that's a lot of information about how people are taking control of their finances. And at this point, I'm going to turn to our favorite topic, which is COVID, and see how people are planning to manage COVID this year. And you probably have your own firsthand information on this as you live your lives and see other people. So, and you may know if you when we listen to the news that we're hearing about a new variant of COVID called Kraken, but this does not seem to be phasing Americans. The COVID might be back, the new variant, but consumers are being way less cautious. And it's not because they're not aware of the risk. So here we have trended information about whether people think there's another wave of COVID coming and if they think it's a risk to their family. And we could see from December to January, there was definitely an uptick of people feeling another wave's coming, feeling it's a risk to them and the people they love. But as we saw in the video at the beginning of the webinar, it seems that people want to forget about it and pretend it's not happening. And they're not taking many precautions to avoid it. So for every COVID precaution we surveyed respondents about, and they're listed here, we have seen a decline versus last year. So in particular, people are done with masks, they're done with social distancing, and they're even done with washing their hands regularly, which does sound a little bit gross. So these are all the things people were doing when the pandemic started, and then compared to last year, there really has been a decline in them taking these precautions. But what's really, this might not be so surprising, as you know, we see the world around us, but what is surprising is how people who think they might have COVID are behaving. So we asked people if they suspected they had COVID, but they had mild symptoms or asymptomatic, what would they do? And we see here, there's an increase in going on with life as usual, and there's a decrease in isolating from other people. So that's really surprising that people who think they might have COVID are starting to not even care or do anything about it and just going forward and not really worrying about infecting other people. So even though there's a decline in safety around COVID, it doesn't mean that people aren't concerned about their overall health. So we asked people in January about their New Year's resolutions for the coming year, and we found out that the top resolutions were really centered around health, healthy eating, exercise, and a focus on mental health. And when it comes to mental health, there is more interest among millennials and Gen X than Gen Z and boomers. So it seems those generations in the middle, millennials and Gen X, are having more of a need to deal with mental health issues. But unfortunately, access to mental health is not so easy. So when thinking about what kind of healthcare options they want to see more of, over a third of Americans are looking for more mental health support, which is an 8% increase from last year. People are also looking for more convenient healthcare, online healthcare services, and meeting with the healthcare providers virtually, which again is something that started during the pandemic and seems to be taking off. So now I'm going to hand it back to Nami, and he's going to cover our last topic about the climate and what to expect for the next year and how people are dealing or not dealing with environmental issues.
Great, thanks, Allison. So as we discussed earlier, consumers do care about the environment, but it is being deprioritized, and we will likely continue to see some of that same behavior into this year as we did last year. So nearly 3/4 of consumers feel the environment issues are important. That's a combination of sort of very important and somewhat important. And most people think we should and can still try to save the planet. So the two boxes highlighted there, people saying the environment is at risk, but there's still time to act. And people saying that the environment's at a critical stage and the world must act now. Only 5% feel like it's too late, we shouldn't do anything because the world is going to crap anyways. And then you've got about 1/4 of Americans that are on the left-hand side that are saying, the environment is either not a concern or it's overblown. So, 2/3 are saying that there is time to act and we should act. But when we asked about New Year's resolutions, only 15% said that they were looking to adopt more environmentally friendly behaviors in 2023. So not a huge jump. We asked another question about whether the government should prioritize the economy or the environment, and we had over half of Americans feel that the government should prioritize the economy, even if it means making decisions that are bad for the environment. So, again, people care. It's very hard for them to act right now. The other thing we'll say, and this is really important, is that citizens aren't unified in terms of their view of the environment. And we saw that in the earlier part of this presentation. There's room for improvement in terms of making it easier for consumers to act and the choices that they should be making. One of the coolest things we've done as part of the Essentials study over the past couple of years, it's one of my favorite part of the studies, is we've developed a really good understanding of how consumers make sustainable choices. And we've done that through the lens of sustainability segmentation. We built it within the Essentials survey. We run it quarterly. We have since Q4 of 2021. We've also published a free white paper, so if you're interested in that, just reach out. It's called Environment Sustainability, Who Cares? But for today, I'm just going to give you a flavor of the segments and some of their underlying behaviors. So you see on the left there's your disengaged denialists, 24% of Americans. Those are the ones that are feeling like, the environment's not a concern or it's overblown. Good luck reaching them with any of your sustainability initiatives. They're not going to focus on that. Next, you have your busy bystanders, also about 1/4 of Americans. Now, this group, interestingly, they do care about the environment and they want to do the right thing, but this group over-indexes on your sort of middle-income households with kids. These are busy young professionals. A lot of them are parents, and while they care and they feel guilty about it, they just don't have the time to commit to it. They're busy, they have other priorities, and the environment is most likely to get deprioritized. So then you have your conflicted contributors. They care, and they have the time to devote to it, but they don't have the funds to devote to it. So that's 16% of Americans. They want to do the right thing, they just can't afford it, particularly right now with everything that's going on with inflation and rising prices. Then you have your pragmatists. It's 20% of Americans, 21% of Americans. So they care, they have the time, and they have the money to devote to it, but they don't always do the right things. They do the things that they feel are right. So they're, this is a group, it's over indexes on older Americans, boomers, higher income households that they have money to spend, but they're doing the things that are, again, they feel, from that chart we said, what do you feel like is most impactful? Recycling, changing light bulbs, those are the things that these people are doing. Then your final group is your activists, 16% of Americans. They care, they have the time, they have the money, and they know the right thing to do, and they're doing all the right, the activities that we would hope that people would be doing to try to improve the situation. So disengaged denialists, don't care, don't bother. Busy bystanders, they care, they don't have the time. Conflicted contributors, they care, they have the time, but they don't have the money. Your pragmatists, they care, they have the time, they have the money, but they don't have the know-how, and your activists are the group that does it all. So those are the segments, and what we've seen really interesting over the past year is the segment that's been growing the most is actually your busy bystanders. So again, this is the group that they feel like they just don't have the time because of everything going on. And if you remember some of the data we talked about today, where people are spending more time cooking, more time cleaning, more time working, they're hustling, they have side hustles, it's no surprise that this group has increased in size by 7% versus 9 months ago. And we expect that to either sustain or potentially even continue into 2023. Now just a quick plug on the segmentation. The segmentation is also available for non-subscribers. So I mentioned we're going to update it quarterly in the Essentials, but this is a module. It's 3 questions. It's got a typing tool if you're doing a custom study with Ipsos and you want us to include this in your custom study. It's 100% available. Just talk to your rep and say, hey, we want the sustainability segmentation included in the study, and you can look at how, for your categories, for the behaviors that you care about, how the different groups play out. Okay, so to summarize what we're seeing as we kick off 2023, I'm going to pass it back to Allison, and then I'll be back to wrap up in a moment.
Okay, thanks again, Nami. So we've seen how consumers, we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, Allison, I'm not sure what happened there.
Okay.
But can you see it now?
Okay. Sure.
Okay.
We saw how consumers are rising to the challenges of 2023 and that they're paving, I would say, new roads versus last year. So what does this mean for marketers? First, of course, marketers need to empathize with consumers, especially for financial pressures, and recognize that consumers are not being shy about switching brands and changing stores to make ends meet. So anything brands can do to develop value propositions will help, of course, retain loyalty. Second, we see that consumers want to take control of their finances and their health, but this really isn't about COVID anymore. Mental health in particular is a real need that consumers are not maybe addressing so well since they can't get the access to healthcare, mental health care that they need. So this is, mental health can really be addressed from different dimensions, I would say, and really creates opportunities for brands in a variety of categories to offer assistance and fulfill needs. And thirdly, in terms of the environment, consumers feel that they are doing enough currently. They're looking for the government and businesses to pitch in more. So if brands can offer environmental benefits, which normally are most effective when they're marketed as co-benefits to the brand, this is certainly very helpful, and of course to let consumers know the responsibility that you're taking. So at this point, we're ready almost to conclude the webinar. We're almost out of time, and we really hope you found it informative. And I'm just going to go back to Nami for a few final remarks.
Great, thanks. And again, hope you found it insightful. Just want to remind everyone, this is just, sort of tip of the iceberg, some really high level stuff from the past year. And as we look at January and into 2023 from the US, we do track this monthly. We are in 15 different countries. We have more qualitative deep dives. And actually the focus we've been asked by our current subscribers in the new year is to focus more on qual from our younger generations. So let's hear more from Gen Zs and millennials. So we're going to be sort of doubling down on Gen Z and millennial videos this year. And we have all the sort of demo tables available to subscribers if you want everything cut by age or income or Republicans, Democrats, by country. We do all of that as well. And there is an option to add custom questions to the study. So if you want to have all of these metrics, filtered by a couple custom questions, we can do that as well, certainly. We touched on a few different verticals, but we cover a lot. So if we didn't talk about your specific category, chances are we do have insights about it. We just didn't get a chance to talk about it today. So please reach out and see what we have related to your category. And finally, just a couple of quick quotes there on the right. As we talk to subscribers in terms of how this is being used, a lot say that this goes up to our C-suite. We do a lot of support for executive presentations, as well as some of the deeper category specific insights. So with that, I'll wrap up. As Ellen said at the beginning, the recording is available. We also have a couple of informational sheets available for download as part of the webinar as well. And I think with that, hopefully everyone, again, found it insightful, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes, I think, for questions. If people do want to ask questions, I'm happy to stay on. I know we're a little bit over the time by 5 minutes, but happy to stick around for questions if people have some.
Thank you, Nami. We do have one question here, actually a couple of questions. The question is the increase in busy bystanders coming from any specific segments?
Oh, so like which demographics? So I'm not sure where the growth is coming from, but I will say that the busy bystander group in general, it over-indexes on young professionals. It's more likely to be millennials, more likely to be parents, higher income, higher education folks, and so I would guess it'd be those coming from those groups, but that's something we can certainly look into in terms of where that actual growth is coming from, if it's perhaps other subgroups within that.
Okay, another question we have here is, now that the pandemic is over, do you expect people to do their banking more in person or online? We're seeing people are wanting to get advice in person.
Yeah, so that's, I think, in reference to the chart you shared, Allison. So it's interesting because we do see an increase. I think there's two things going on. There's your everyday banking, and then there's your big decisions, like mortgages and investments. And certainly what we're seeing for that everyday banking, during the pandemic, we saw an increase in people doing it online and via the app, and a decrease in ATM usage and a decrease in branch visits. But for I think some of those bigger decisions, mortgages, investments, people do. You're right. Whoever was asking the question, I think is correct in saying that people do want to speak to an individual for those bigger decisions. Interestingly, what we saw though is that when it comes to meeting with someone face-to-face in person or doing it virtually, that both are equally effective. So in terms of how important it is to meet with someone in person versus virtually, and how easy it is to meet with someone virtually or in person, they're kind of tied. And so that's a metric we looked at as well. So definitely a little bit of a nuance on that one.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question, and then we will email responses to the rest of the questions and make sure to get back to everybody who's asked. But one last question, which I'll read, is how does the subscription to Essentials work? Do you get a separate subscription for each country?
So good question. You don't. It's so we shared the U.S. Data today, and that's included as part of a global subscription. So if you subscribe, you get all 15 countries, you have all the data. We provide tables by country, so you can look at your country specific view, but it is a global subscription. So if you have colleagues in Canada or Latin America or Europe that you work with, and you buy one essential subscription, it covers everybody globally in all the countries. We don't have a country specific subscription.
Okay, so like I said, we'll follow up with everyone else's question via email since we are a little bit over time now. And I thank you for joining us, and Nami and I hope you found it very useful.